Government Gay, Alex Reynolds series, Book 1. Writer, Fred Hunter, St. Martin's Press, New York, 1997. Narrator, Eric Arst. Dedicated for Joan Edwards, who told me so. Chapter 10. We parked and waited down the street from our house until a patrol car showed up. Mother introduced herself, and she did a credible job of producing a story that was long on drama and short on details, about having been at home alone when she heard a noise, peeked through a curtain, and saw the man. She acted suitably befuddled when it came to explaining which window she'd looked, and how she knew he had a gun, since, as the red-headed, befreckled officer pointed out, it would have been unusual for a perp to be prowling around with a gun in his hand, which he somehow managed to make sound obscene. Mother explained breathlessly that she just knew he had a gun, and she actually managed to elicit one of those typical woman smiles from the redhead, which made me angry because he made no attempt to disguise it. You would think that someone who is paid by our tax dollars would at least try to look like he didn't think you were an idiot. "And where were you two during all this?" he said, turning to Peter and me. "Out," Peter replied flatly. "We just got back." The other officer, an extremely handsome Italian-looking man, dark skin, dark mustache, dark hair, dark eyes, not that I was noticing, asked Mother for her keys, and then the two officers told us to wait by the car while they investigated. The redhead mumbled something to the Italian as they walked up the steps, and they both quietly laughed. But they didn't think the situation funny enough to take chances, and both drew their guns before the Italian slid the key in the door as quietly as possible and opened it. After listening for a moment, they disappeared inside the house. Unless you have experienced it, the sensations you go through while waiting for the police to reach for an armed man inside your house are something that you simply can't explain. On the other hand, I told myself this was just a clever precaution on Mother's part to make sure that the coast was clear. On the other hand, it was perfectly logical to believe, given what the now dead Clay person had said to me, that his partner really was there and would undoubtedly be armed. After what seemed ages, the Italian policeman appeared in the doorway and beckoned to us. From the stoic look on his face, it was impossible to tell if he'd found an empty house or a dead body. "It's all clear," he said as we passed through the door, "but somebody's definitely been there." He had led us through to the kitchen, where his partner was squatting by the back door, which stood wide open. "We found it like this," said the redhead as he continued his examination of the door jamb. "Oh my God," said Mother, all color drained from her face. "He was here!" The Italian turned his beautiful quizzical brown eyes on my mother and said, "But you know someone was here." She mumbled and stuttered and finally managed to get out, "Oh yes, of course." There followed a rather lengthy bout of questions, during which Mother described the man as she saw. Well, actually, she described the man we'd seen at the zoo, since we were fairly certain that was who'd broken in. The red-headed officer got a bit testy about Mother's fuzziness on the facts, such as which window she'd looked through when she saw him, but, of course, it's rather difficult to come up with an accurate eyewitness account of what you thought happened when you hadn't actually been there to see it. But Mother did manage a credible story of having seen him through one of the back windows heading for the back door, and how she'd fled in terror out the front door to the nearest payphone. "Locking the door behind you, ma'am," said the redhead skeptically. Mother looked startled, then shrugged and said sheepishly, "Force of habit?" When she'd finally managed to put together a clear enough story for them, the Italian officer took her hand and said very sincerely, "You did really well. You were very brave." And that's when Frank arrived. At first I thought it was an unexpected appearance, and that Mother's fears about calling him, lest he thought she was trying to rekindle their romance, were justified. However, we were soon to learn that his visit was not at all unexpected. "What are you doing here?" said Mother as he walked past her into the living room. The officers greeted him, said they were just about finished there, and quickly left. Frank turned to my mother. "I want to know what the hell's going on, Jean." "What prompted you to come here just now?" she replied, stalling. "All of my people have orders to notify me of any calls they get pertaining to you or this address." Mother's back stiffened noticeably, and her features drew together. "I think that's going a bit far, don't you?" Frank was not going to be put off on this occasion. He met her solid gaze with a steely one of his own. No, I don't think it's going far enough. First, Alex here is present at a bar on an evening when one of its patrons is murdered and he's beaten up. Then you call me over here because your house has been broken into and ransacked. Then you call the police and report someone with a gun is trying to break into your house. It would take a bigger jerk than I am not to recognize that something is going on here, and I want to know what it is. Mother was stumped. It really had gotten to the point where it would be folly to deny that we were in the soup. I was just glad that he hadn't mentioned the murder of the big clay person on his list of our escapades. Frank broke the silence with, "Look, Gene, if you're in trouble, and you obviously are, then tell me about it. I'm the goddamn area commander, for Christ's sake. I can help." "Frank, I can't," said Mother at last. He smoothed back his hair and wandered to the windows. He parted the heavy curtain slightly and glanced out. With his back to the three of us, he said, "You know there's an interesting thing about Victor Haycheck?" "Who?" I blurted out too quickly. Frank turned from the window and stared at me. He wasn't smiling, but there was something about his expression that gave a sense of triumph. "The man who was killed at the gay bar? It turns out his name was Victor Haycheck. It seems he had something to do with the CIA." "How do you know that?" said Peter. Frank's gaze pivoted over to Peter. "Because someone from the CIA came to talk to me about him. Seems the feds don't want us lowly cops looking into that murder. They think we might blow something they're working on." "Who did you talk to?" said Peter. "Someone named Nelson? More than that, I can't say." Peter and I exchanged glances. Nobody named Nelson has been mentioned to us. "So you're not investigating Haycheck's murder?" I said. Well, I agreed that we'd try to keep it quiet, but I told Nelson that there was no way I was going to just let a murder in my area go. Frank looked at each one of us in turn, then continued, "Now, what I want to know is, what do the three of you have to do with this? Are you mixed up in it somehow?" Mother and Peter and I glanced at each other. "Sit down, Frank." Mother explained the whole lurid story to him, while I listened and Peter made tea. It was by rights a rather involved story, what with the real and bogus Mr. Martins and all, but there are some things in which Mother excels, and one is in the relating of facts without embellishment. However, she did stretch it a bit when she explained that she hadn't told him about it sooner because she didn't want to get him involved in something dangerous. I think she did this merely to assuage the manly prides so common to straight men, because I was beginning to think the real reason she hadn't told him the whole story before was that she'd been enjoying our foray into espionage and hadn't wanted Frank to interfere. She did leave out a few facts, mainly tonight's encounter and the man being shot. I'm not sure why she did this, other than the fact that Frank was, after all, a policeman, and my presence at 2 homicides in 1 week might be too much to overlook, even for someone who loves her. She simply explained that we had run into one of the bad guys this evening and had managed to put him off, but had been afraid the other would be waiting at our home, hence our call to the police. By the time she had finished, our tea had been served and we were seated around the room, and the atmosphere was a little more relaxed, as if we were sitting there discussing a movie we'd seen. Frank turned to me and said, "You say you turned the matchbook over to the feds?" "Yes," I replied with a nod. "Then why did this agent, or whatever he is, think you were lying? Were you?" I might have been offended under normal circumstances, but under these I simply looked baffled. "No, I really turned it over to Martin, the real one, at the CIA after Mother was there." She nodded her assent. "Then I don't get why this guy thought you still had it." "Neither do I, but he did." Frank stood up, shaking his head and clucking his tongue disgustedly. "I don't like the idea of you being involved in this at all." "I told you," said Mother with a roll of her crystal blue eyes, her tone becoming more exasperated. We became involved by accident." "Well, you didn't have to stay involved. You didn't have to go mixing around with these people." "We didn't go mixing around with anyone. They came here and mixed with us. We didn't invite them." "That's not what I meant," said Frank hotly. Frank's skin reddens when he becomes angry, as he was now. Unfortunately, on him it doesn't look like temper. It looks like the flush of chronic alcoholism. "Blaming the victim?" Peter muttered. "Typical." Frank shot him a glance and then said to Mother, "I only meant that if you were in danger, you should have called me." "I did call you." "You didn't tell me what was wrong." "That's beside the point. I should have been told you were in danger." "Why?" said Mother icily. "So you could protect me?" Frank glanced back at the floor, the redness of his complexion deepening. He clenched and unclenched his hands. No, you just should have reported the whole thing to the proper authorities. The proper authorities in this case, said Mother's affecting English primness, were the CIA, and we didn't go to them, they came to us. An imposter came to you. Well, we didn't know that at the time, said Mother, waving her hands as if she were brushing away a minor point. And besides, when we found that blasted thing that was passed to Alex, we took it to the CIA straight away. Frank started to say something, but Mother cut him off quickly with, the real CIA. She folded her arms and squarely faced Frank. She fell about 5 inches short of his 6-foot-tall, 2-inch frame, but for some reason, whenever she faces up to him, she exudes height. Gene, he said sternly, be reasonable. At least let me have somebody watch the house. The way things are going, even you must understand that you need protection. Peter burst into the conversation before my mother could answer. No, no way. Look, there's no way I want the police watching this house. What do you have to do with it? Said Frank. He may be fairly liberal, and he may love my mother, and he may accept me and my relationship with Peter in theory, but it's amazing how when your authority is challenged, all that can go out the window. I didn't like the look on his face or his tone of voice when he said that to Peter, because both implied that Peter didn't belong here at all. I won't live in a goddamn police state, no matter what the cause. Peter was turning a bit red in the face himself, and I feared we were headed for real trouble. But I had to agree with him. I wouldn't want to live in a house being watched by the police for any reason. It would anticipate trouble in a way that I find more distressing than the trouble itself, as if the presence of the police would cause trouble instead of preventing it. That may seem illogical, but that's the way I was thinking. Well, it's not up to you, is it? Said Frank with a derisive twitch of his nose. Peter turned to Mother, and she looked back at him, smiled, and said, It's all right, dear. I agree with you. Gene, you're acting like... Mother held up one smooth, well-manicured hand palm toward Frank and said, Franklin, do not under any circumstances finish that sentence. Franklin looked down at the floor again and ran a hand through his hair, his frustration palpable. When he raised his eyes to my mother, they had taken on a forlorn quality that hadn't been there before. He said quietly, Gene, why won't you let me do anything? Mother's hand dropped to her side and her face softened in her eyes. There was evidence that the love she'd had for Frank before their breakup had survived in a different form, something that was no longer romantic, but still loyal and capable of being touched. Touched, but not ignited. After a moment, she turned to Peter and me and said, Boys. Peter and I glanced at each other, his face saying, Let's get out of here. He didn't know quite how far out of here I wanted to get. I said aloud, Oh, yeah, well, we have something to do. We crossed the room, passing Mother and Frank, who stood facing each other, in a silence that was partially embarrassed and partially anxious. Peter had started up the stairs before he realized that I was halfway out the front door. We both stopped, and Peter shot me a questioning glance, which I answered with a nod toward the outside. He stepped back down the stairs and passed me as I was about to close the door when Mother realized we were leaving the house and called, Wait, Alex, where are you going? We're just going to move the car, I called back, closing the door behind me before she could protest. All things considered, it would probably have been best for us to stay indoors the rest of the night, but I had no desire to hang around the house while Mother and Frank worked out whatever they needed to work out. And besides, we really did have things to do. Peter was on me before we'd even hit the front walk. Where the hell are we going? It's almost midnight. We've got to get on to the bottom of this, I said, hurrying down the sidewalk. I was hurrying partly because I was anxious to start really trying to work this mess out on my own, with the help of Mother and Peter, and partly because the atmosphere on Fullerton Avenue in the middle of the night is conducive to hurry. It's so dark, with the closely packed townhouses and other buildings and occasional foliage, that you get the sense, justifiably or not, that people are watching you, probably because there are so many vantage points from which to do so. And hurrying has a practical side. A moving target is harder to hit. I agree we have to get to the bottom of this mess, Peter said, and we obviously can't rely on the CIA. Christ, we can't even tell who the real CIA men are, but in the middle of the night? It's not far from here. What's not? What are you going to do? Well, what I want to do is find out why Jerry Lasker is afraid of me. It was during that short walk to the car that I realized something for the first time. I was really feeling exhilarated. Now that I had decided to take positive action in unraveling what was going on around us, acting instead of reacting, I could suddenly understand what I'd sensed in both my mother and myself earlier. I'd been wrong about the cause, though I hadn't been indulging in a sordid thirst for cheap thrills when I'd been disappointed because I thought the business was ended, and Mother hadn't been exalted in luridness when I noticed the glow on her face as she pressed the gas pedal as we made our getaway from the rendezvous earlier this evening. It had been something deeper. Though I had over the years built up a good freelancing business, and I like to think that I'm fairly well regarded in the field in which I work, I can't say that designing covers for corporate brochures was doing anything to enhance the world or enhance my own self. As for Mother, she lives off my former father's former insurance and all, and fortunately doesn't have to work, and she's probably the kindest person I'd ever known, but the look in her eyes as we sped up LaSalle showed me something that I should have noticed long ago. Since I love her, something was missing from her life. Hell, not just her life, my life too. We were both, along with Peter, living comfortably, and that was exactly the problem. I don't think either Mother or I realized it until this whole business began, but our lives had become comfortable and purposeless. And then one night in a bar, a matchbook was slipped into my pocket, and suddenly our lives had some sort of direction. So far, as I led the way to the car, I suddenly felt like Olivia de Havilland in Government Girl, ready to bypass the system, take on the big boys, and fight for what was right. All right, so in my case it was government gay, and I didn't have any idea what was going on or what I was getting myself into. At least I felt that I had something important to do. Figure out why Victor Haycheck was killed and what the significance of the matchbook was. I hesitated only a little when I remembered that 2 people had already been killed, and there was no reason to believe that we wouldn't be next. A Gay Mysteries audiobooks. I think it is easy to hate a label, but a face humanizes the word. So this effort is twofold: to offer comfort to those like myself that your world didn't end because you don't fit into the view of acceptable society on both sides, and in hopes of helping those with family that are LGBTQ, that it doesn't mean we are aliens from the child they once knew. Reassure them so they can maybe be supportive at the same time, being true to their values.